On November 18, 1944, at 0427 hours on Bougainville Island, Corporal James Mitchell, a 23-year-old Massachusetts native, lay in a hastily constructed foxhole atop Hill 260. His position overlooked a jungle tree line approximately 200 yards down the slope. The trembling in his hands stemmed not solely from fear, though such emotions were abundantly present in the pre-dawn darkness, but rather from the profound responsibility represented by the modified weapon resting beside him. This was a Browning automatic rifle, model 1918A2, but this particular specimen incorporated modifications that military leadership believed would fundamentally alter combat effectiveness. The pre-dawn atmosphere carried distinctive sounds through the humid air, rustling vegetation, deliberate movement, the particular quality of noise that caused visceral reactions in experienced soldiers who understood what such sounds portended. Mitchell's unit, Baker Company of the 3rd Marine Division, had maintained this defensive position for 6 consecutive days. Each night brought Japanese attacks. Each night brought the desperate vulnerability that occurred when his weapon's magazine emptied at critical moments. 20 rounds represented the weapon's total capacity before requiring reload. 20 rounds in a weapon specifically designed to provide sustained suppressive fire. 20 rounds when Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized overwhelming numerical superiority during night assaults. Combat operations on Guadalcanal in 1942, Tarawa in 1943, and Saipan and Peleliu in 1944 produced consistent reports of the same tactical problem. BAR gunners would exhaust their magazines in approximately 4 seconds of sustained fire, then fumble with replacement magazines while enemy infantry closed the distance. The casualty statistics presented sobering evidence. During the November 1943 Tarawa operation, the 2nd Marine Division suffered 3,407 casualties within 76 hours. After-action reports specifically cited magazine changes as representing critical vulnerability periods during Japanese counterattacks. At Peleliu in September 1944, the 1st Marine Division documented 57 separate incidents where BAR gunners were killed or wounded during magazine change procedures. The weapon's cyclic firing rate of 500 to 650 rounds per minute meant a 20-round magazine lasted approximately 2.4 seconds during continuous fire. The Marine Corps desperately needed sustained firepower capability. They required weapon systems capable of disrupting mass charges without leaving gunners vulnerable during reload procedures. However, increasing magazine capacity presented significant engineering challenges. The BAR's bottom-loading magazine design was integral to the weapon's fundamental architecture. Larger magazines would add weight, increase susceptibility to feed failures in tropical jungle conditions, and prove incompatible with prone firing positions. The solution emerged from an unexpected source. In July 1944, Captain Theodore Walsh of the Ordnance Corps, stationed at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, was reviewing declassified German weapons research documentation. German engineers had experimented with explosive ammunition for aircraft weapons, developing rounds that detonated upon impact or proximity to increase effectiveness against bomber aircraft. Walsh perceived different possibilities. He theorized that standard ammunition could achieve significantly enhanced damage potential without requiring fundamental changes to basic cartridge specifications. He requisitioned 500 M2 explosive primers, components typically employed in 40mm grenade launchers, and secured workshop space at Aberdeen. The M2 primer contained 96 milligrams of RDX explosive compound, sufficient to detonate the main propellant charge in a 40mm projectile. Walsh theorized that crimping these primers into reinforced .30-06 cartridge cases would create rounds that exploded upon impact, multiplying the BAR's effectiveness without requiring new weapons platforms or extensive training modifications. Initial testing on August 3, 1944, produced encouraging results. Standard .30-06 armor-piercing rounds penetrated ballistic gelatin test targets with minimal cavitation effects. The explosive primer rounds created cavitation channels approximately 4 times larger with secondary fragmentation characteristics. More significantly, when test-fired at wooden barriers simulating jungle vegetation, the explosive rounds cleared substantially more foliage. However, significant problems emerged during testing. The explosive primers generated approximately 18% more chamber pressure than standard rounds. Continuous firing created risks of catastrophic barrel failure. Walsh's solution demonstrated elegant simplicity. Load explosive rounds as every 5th cartridge. 4 standard rounds would maintain reliable feeding mechanisms and manageable recoil characteristics. 1 explosive round would multiply combat effectiveness. This loading pattern created predictable rhythm, suppressive fire with standard ammunition, devastating impact with explosive rounds, all delivered from identical magazines. By September 15, 1944, Aberdeen had manufactured 50,000 modified .30-06 M2 high explosive. The cartridge cases featured reinforced bases and were marked with a single red identification band. The Ordnance Department classified the project as secret and assigned it to ComSpec, Commander Special Weapons Pacific, a relatively obscure logistics command responsible for evaluating experimental ordnance under actual combat conditions. The first shipment reached Guadalcanal on October 8, 1944. 6,000 rounds provided sufficient quantity to equip one Marine company with modified BAR ammunition loads for comprehensive field testing. Baker Company, 3rd Marine Division, received selection for this program. They were deploying to Bougainville, where Japanese forces retained significant territorial control, and night attacks occurred with predictable regularity. The Marines developed informal terminology for this ammunition. They called them hot rounds or snappers because of the distinctive acoustic signature upon impact. The official designation proved too cumbersome for combat usage. What they could not anticipate was Japanese terminology. If properly documented viewer engagement could demonstrate interest in understanding how these experimental rounds performed under actual combat conditions and why they were immediately classified following the war, such engagement would be appreciated. This story remained buried in classified files for 35 years, and the reasons for this classification would soon become apparent. Returning to Corporal Mitchell's situation, the .3006 M2 high explosive round appeared nearly identical to standard ammunition. Length measured 3.34 inches. Case diameter measured .473 inches. Projectile weight was 150 grains, identical to M2 armor-piercing rounds. The only visible distinction was the red band painted around the cartridge case 1/4 inch from the base. Internal differences were substantial. The case wall was manufactured from manganese bronze alloy rather than standard brass, providing 40% greater tensile strength to accommodate the explosive primer's pressure characteristics. The case wall thickness at the base measured .025 inches versus .008 inches for standard cases. This reinforcement added 12 grains to total cartridge weight, a difference barely noticeable when loaded in magazines. The M2 explosive primer sat in a specially machined primer pocket, deeper than standard specifications to accommodate the primer's greater length. The primer contained 96 milligrams of RDX explosive, cyclotrimethylene trinitramine, the identical compound utilized in Composition C3 plastic explosive. This represented significantly more energetic potential than the standard Boxer primer's 4 milligrams of lead styphnate. When the firing pin struck the primer, the RDX detonated with approximately 18,400 feet per second of brisance, the shattering effect characteristic of explosive detonation. This detonation served dual functions. First, it ignited the 47 grains of IMR 4895 propellant powder, driving the projectile through the barrel at 2,700 feet per second. Second, it transmitted a shock wave through the propellant, ensuring more complete combustion and consequently higher muzzle velocity. The projectile itself incorporated modifications. The standard .3006 armor-piercing round utilized a hardened steel core. The M2HE round employed a mild steel core surrounded by a copper jacket, with the forward section containing a small cavity filled with 8 grains of additional RDX. Upon impact, deceleration forces triggered this charge, causing the projectile to fragment into 15 to 20 pieces rather than remaining intact. To understand this conceptually, a standard .3006 round functions similarly to a nail driven through wood, creating a penetrating hole. The M2HE round functions like a small cracker that activates after initial penetration. It creates a hole, then explodes internally, creating multiple wound channels and clearing vegetation in a small radius. The pressure spike from the explosive primer represented the critical engineering challenge. Peak chamber pressure during standard .3006 firing measures approximately 50,000 pounds per square inch. The M2HE round generated 58,000 psi. This remained within the bar's design tolerance of 65,000 psi, but prolonged firing could accelerate barrel wear significantly. Aberdeen's testing demonstrated that continuous firing of M2HE rounds could reduce barrel service life from 10,000 rounds to 6,500 rounds. The 5-round spacing pattern resolved this issue. 4 standard rounds at 50,000 psi, 1 M2HE at 58,000 psi, creating an average of 51,600 psi over 5 rounds, well within safe operational parameters. The spacing also facilitated recoil management. The M2HE round produced 22% more recoil energy than standard ammunition. Continuous firing would render the bar nearly uncontrollable during automatic fire. The 4-round spacing pattern allowed shooters to anticipate the harder recoiling round and maintain aim. The ammunition was packaged in standard 20-round BAR magazines, preloaded at Aberdeen with correct spacing. Each magazine contained 16 standard M2 ball rounds and 4 M2HE rounds in the 5th, 10th, 15th, and 20th positions. Magazines were marked with yellow tape on the base plate for identification. Sergeants in Baker Company received the shipment on November 12, 1944 at their Bougainville staging area. They received minimal instruction. Load these magazines, fire normally, expect slightly increased muzzle flash, report results. The security classification meant they could not discuss the ammunition with anyone outside their unit. They did not know precisely what the rounds would accomplish beyond increased effectiveness on target. Corporal Mitchell received his first yellow-taped magazine on November 13th. He loaded it into his BAR in the armory tent, ejected it, loaded it again. The rounds appeared normal except for the red bands. They felt normal. Magazine weight was identical to standard loads. He asked Sergeant Davis what made them special. Davis shrugged. They would discover the answer when they shot somebody with them. 5 days later, they discovered the answer. At 0428 hours on November 18, 1944, Mitchell observed them approaching, shadows resolving into distinct shapes. The Japanese were employing their standard tactical approach, loose formation, utilizing every available cover element, attempting to close within grenade range before executing the final rush. He counted 8, then 12, then 20. They continued advancing. His BAR was set to automatic fire, selector switch positioned fully forward, bipod legs deployed. The weapon angled down the slope, tracking the movement at 180 yards distance. Sergeant Davis issued no verbal order. None was necessary. Every Marine on the defensive line understood the established procedure. Wait until targets were close enough to guarantee hits. Wait until they committed to the charge, then break their momentum. At 150 yards, the shapes clearly resolved as human figures, moving with increasing speed. The rustling transformed into crashing. Someone shouted in Japanese. At 125 yards, Mitchell's finger tightened on the trigger. The BAR's foregrip was slick with morning condensation. His breathing steadied. He selected a target, the leading figure moving directly up the trail. At 100 yards, the Japanese forces began screaming. This was not a war cry, but rather a tactical signal. The scattered formation converged into a mass charge. 40 men, perhaps 50, screaming and running uphill directly toward Baker Company's defensive position. Mitchell fired. The BAR hammered out its distinctive rhythm. 4 rounds discharged in a 3-second burst, standard M2 ball ammunition. He observed impacts on the leading soldier's torso. The soldier collapsed. Mitchell adjusted his aim leftward, fired again, 4 more rounds, then the 5th round. The M2HE round struck a Japanese soldier center mass at 95 yards. The impact appeared visually different. There was a flash, small and orange-colored, barely visible in the pre-dawn light. The soldier did not simply fall. He was thrown backwards, arms spread as if struck by an invisible force. The men on either side of him flinched, stumbled. One collapsed with fragmentation wounds. Mitchell had no time to process these observations. He continued firing. The BAR cycled 4 standard rounds into the mass of charging infantry, then another M2HE round. This one struck a soldier in the shoulder area. The flash was brighter. The soldier's arms separated. 2 men behind him screamed. The charge hesitated, wavered. These were experienced Japanese infantrymen. They had faced BAR fire previously. They knew the sound, the rhythm, the pattern. This was fundamentally different. Their men were not simply falling, they were being torn apart. The spacing of the explosive rounds appeared random from their perspective. Every few seconds, someone detonated. Mitchell's magazine ran empty at 0429 hours. He had fired 20 rounds in approximately 8 seconds. He dropped the empty magazine, reached for a fresh one, yellow tape on the base plate. He slammed it home, charged the weapon, resumed firing. The entire Marine defensive line was engaging now. Rifle fire, grenades, mortar rounds landing in the jungle behind the Japanese formation. However, Mitchell could observe his rounds working distinctively. Each M2HE impact created a small cleared space. Vegetation shredded. Men fell in groups rather than individually. His second magazine emptied. He reloaded. The Japanese charge had broken. They were retreating, dragging wounded, leaving bodies. He fired into the retreating formation, controlled bursts, 4 rounds. The 5th round impacted a tree trunk. The explosive charge detonated, showering bark and splinters. 2 Japanese soldiers stumbled, faces bloodied. By 0432 hours, the attack had concluded, 4 minutes from first shot to silence. Mitchell's hands shook violently now from adrenaline. He had fired 3 magazines, 60 rounds total. 12 of them were M2HE rounds. He looked down the slope. The results were visible even in poor light. Bodies lay in small craters. Vegetation was cleared in spots as if something had exploded, which indeed it had. The visual effect was disproportionate to the actual explosive force, but in the chaos of night combat, it appeared devastating. Sergeant Davis moved along the defensive line checking on his men. Nobody was hit. Baker Company took no casualties. In previous attacks on Hill 260, they had averaged 3 wounded per engagement. This time, 0. Davis stopped at Mitchell's foxhole, looked at the empty magazines, looked down the slope, looked at Mitchell. He wanted to know what had been in those rounds. Mitchell did not know, but he knew it had worked. At 04:30 hours after dawn, a patrol moved down the slope to assess enemy casualties and collect intelligence. They counted 23 Japanese dead, but the wounds appeared unusual. Entry wounds showed massive cavitation. Several bodies displayed fragmentation damage inconsistent with grenade or mortar fire. One soldier's rifle was bent, the wooden stock shattered, as if something had exploded in proximity. The patrol's corpsman, Navy Hospital Man 2nd Class Robert Chen, examined the bodies. He had observed thousands of gunshot wounds. These were different. He found copper jacket fragments and small amounts of explosive residue. He reported this to the company commander, Captain William Hayes. Hayes forwarded the report up the chain of command. By 1400 hours, an ordnance officer from Comspec arrived via observation plane. He examined the battlefield. He examined Mitchell's bar. The barrel showed accelerated wear but remained serviceable. He collected the empty magazines. He confiscated Chen's report and classified it as secret. He instructed Captain Hayes to continue using the ammunition and submit daily reports. He instructed the men to tell nobody outside the unit. He flew back to Guadalcanal. What Hayes did not know, what nobody in Baker Company knew, was that 40 miles west, a captured Japanese soldier was being interrogated. He was from a unit that had attacked American positions near Cape Torquena 2 days prior. He described a new American weapon. He did not know what it was, but his unit had developed a name for it. Kaminari-Ju, Thunder Rifle. The Americans translated this as Thunder Beast. By November 25, 1944, Baker Company had expended 4,200 of their 6,000 M2HE rounds. Their combat reports documented 17 engagements involving the modified ammunition. Enemy casualties in these engagements totaled 147 confirmed dead versus 32 confirmed dead in engagements using standard ammunition. More significantly, American casualties dropped dramatically. Pre-M2HE, Baker Company averaged 2.3 casualties per engagement. Post-M2HE, 0.8 casualties per engagement. The statistics convinced Comspec. On December 2, 1944, they requested immediate production of 500,000 rounds from Aberdeen Proving Ground. They also requested expansion of the program to include 30-06 ammunition for the M1 Garand rifle, though this proved technically unfeasible due to the Garand's gas-operated system being sensitive to pressure variations. Aberdeen responded that maximum production capacity was 50,000 rounds per month. The manganese bronze cases required specialized manufacturing processes. The RDX filling process was labor-intensive. The Army could not produce sufficient quantities to supply standard infantry units across the Pacific Theater, but they could supply specialist units. Between December 1944 and August 1945, M2HE ammunition was issued to approximately 2,400 Marines in specialized defensive and raiding roles. This included 3 companies of the 3rd Marine Division on Bougainville, 840 rounds per company, 2 companies of the 1st Marine Division on Peleliu, 840 rounds per company, 4 Marine Raider battalions conducting operations in the Philippines, 200 rounds per battalion, and selected perimeter defense units on Guam, Saipan, and Tinian with variable amounts. The ammunition never received an official nickname. Hot rounds and snappers were common terminology. Thunder rounds emerged after Japanese prisoners used the term kaminari-ju. However, within the small community of Marines who used them, they were simply called red bands after the identifying mark on the cartridge case. The Japanese response evolved rapidly. By January 1945, intelligence intercepts showed Japanese units discussing explosive bullets being used by American forces. Japanese propaganda claimed this violated the Hague Convention prohibition on explosive projectiles under 400 grams, a claim technically incorrect, as the convention specified projectiles weighing below 400 grams designed solely for explosion, whereas the M2HE was a conventional bullet with enhanced fragmentation characteristics. More practically, the Japanese adjusted tactics. Night attacks became more dispersed. Banzai charges were abandoned in favor of infiltration tactics. Where possible, Japanese units avoided engaging American positions known to have thunder rifles. This was precisely the psychological effect ComSpec desired. However, logistics remained challenging. The red-banded cartridges required careful handling. Dropping a loaded magazine could potentially detonate the primers. The rounds could not be stored in temperatures above 110 degrees Fahrenheit due to RDX stability concerns, difficult in the Pacific theater. Barrel wear became significant. BARs firing M2HE ammunition regularly required barrel replacement after 4,000 rounds instead of the standard 8,000. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, Baker Company's armorer, maintained records showing 14 barrel replacements between November 1944 and March 1945, compared to a pre-war average of 3 to 4 per year. The modified ammunition was consuming weapons faster than standard combat use. On February 19, 1945, Marines landed on Iwo Jima. 4 companies carried M2HE ammunition, approximately 3,200 rounds total. The volcanic ash and sand of Iwo Jima proved disastrous for the sensitive ammunition. Feed failures increased. Several rounds detonated in chambers due to overheating from sustained combat. 2 BARs were damaged beyond field repair. The Iwo Jima experience prompted a critical assessment. On March 10, 1945, ComSpec recommended restricting M2HE use to garrison and defensive positions where environmental conditions could be controlled. Offensive operations in harsh terrain were too unpredictable. This recommendation arrived simultaneously with planning for Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu, scheduled for November 1945. Estimates projected 500,000 American casualties. The Joint Chiefs were considering every possible advantage. On July 15, 1945, Aberdeen received orders to increase M2HE production to 200,000 rounds per month by October. This would require expansion of manufacturing facilities, recruiting additional workers, and prioritizing manganese bronze allocation. The program was designated Project Thunder and given high priority. Then, on August 6th and 9th, 1945, atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. Operation Olympic was canceled. Project Thunder was terminated on August 20th, 1945. Total production, 187,400 rounds. The actual mechanism of the M2HE round's enhanced effectiveness involved complex terminal ballistics. When the 150-grain projectile struck a target at 2,700 feet per second, it carried 2,427 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. The impact deceleration occurred over approximately 8 inches of tissue penetration. Basic physics dictated that this deceleration triggered the internal RDX charge. The 8 grains of RDX inside the projectile detonated with a velocity of 27,000 feet per second. This is called detonation velocity, distinct from deflagration, an explosion rather than burning. The energy release was approximately 35 joules, sufficient to fragment the projectile's copper jacket into 15 to 20 pieces weighing 3 to 12 grains each. These fragments radiated outward in a roughly spherical pattern, creating a temporary wound cavity 4.2 times larger than standard M2 ball ammunition. In ballistic gelatin tests, standard rounds created permanent wound cavities measuring 1.2 inches in diameter. M2HE rounds created cavities measuring 5.1 inches in diameter. The difference in a human body meant significantly increased hydrostatic shock and tissue damage. Against vegetation, the effect was even more pronounced. Jungle combat often meant shooting through banana leaves, vines, bamboo, and light brush. Standard ammunition would lose velocity and potentially tumble after passing through multiple layers. The M2HE round would detonate upon hitting heavy vegetation, clearing a small area and potentially injuring personnel behind cover. Field testing showed a single M2HE round could clear approximately 2.3 square feet of light vegetation, leaves and vines. Against bamboo, the round would shatter stalks within a 6-inch radius. This made the ammunition particularly effective for breaking up ambushes and engaging targets using natural cover. However, the limitations were significant. First, the rounds were temperature sensitive. Below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, the RDX could become unstable during firing, causing incomplete detonation. Above 110 degrees, the explosive could degrade or potentially detonate from shock without firing. The Pacific Theater's temperature range was generally suitable, but weapons left in direct sunlight could exceed safe limits. Second, the increased chamber pressure accelerated parts wear beyond just the barrel. The bar's bolt face showed accelerated erosion. The extractor, the small claw that pulled spent cases from the chamber, wore 40% faster. The operating rod that connected the gas piston to the bolt showed stress cracks after approximately 5,000 rounds of mixed standard and M2HE ammunition. Third, the ammunition was less accurate. The explosive primer's slightly erratic detonation introduced minor velocity variations. At ranges under 200 yards, this was negligible. At 400 yards, group sizes increased from 4 inches to 7 inches. The BAR was not designed for precision fire anyway, but the degradation was measurable. Fourth, the sound signature was distinctive. Standard 30-06 gunfire produced a sharp crack. M2HE rounds produced a crack followed a fraction of a second later by a pop from the detonation. Experienced Japanese soldiers learned to recognize this signature. It became a targeting indicator. If you heard the double sound, that position had a thunder rifle. Marines adapted to these limitations. They learned to store magazines in shade and check ammunition temperature before missions. They learned to clean weapons more frequently and request parts replacements earlier than with standard ammunition. They learned to mix standard and M2HE magazines rather than using exclusively modified ammunition, preserving the special rounds for critical moments. Some Marines did not prefer the M2HE rounds. The increased recoil was unpleasant. The accelerated wear meant more maintenance. The occasional feed failure could prove fatal in combat. Private First Class David Wong, Baker Company, told his sergeant he preferred standard ammunition because it was more reliable. Others held different opinions. Corporal Mitchell, after using M2HE rounds in 23 engagements between November 1944 and March 1945, requested nothing else. His reasoning was simple. They kept the Japanese soldiers suppressed longer. That was worth cleaning his weapon twice as often. The enemy perspective came primarily from interrogation reports. Lieutenant Taishi Yamamoto, captured on Bougainville in January 1945, described his unit's experience. They could not understand what weapon made such wounds. Men would fall and explode. They thought perhaps grenades, but there was no throwing. The Americans fired their rifles and their men exploded. It affected morale severely. Japanese medical personnel examining their own casualties noted the unusual fragmentation patterns and explosive residue. Several intelligence reports referenced American explosive bullets, but the Japanese never determined the rounds were standard ammunition with modified primers. They assumed it was an entirely new weapon system. This confusion represented strategic advantage. The Japanese could not effectively counter a weapon they did not understand. On September 2, 1945, Japan formally surrendered aboard USS Missouri. Within weeks, the U.S. military began rapid demobilization. Experimental weapons programs were evaluated for peacetime relevance. Project Thunder did not make the cut. On October 15, 1945, the War Department ordered all remaining M2HE ammunition recalled to Aberdeen Proving Ground for disposal. Approximately 89,200 rounds remained in inventory. These were destroyed by controlled detonation between October and December 1945. The manufacturing equipment at Aberdeen was dismantled. The technical specifications were classified as secret and archived. The ammunition's combat use was similarly classified. Marines who had used the rounds were ordered not to discuss them. After-action reports mentioning M2HE ammunition were redacted or reclassified. The program disappeared from official history. Several factors drove this decision. First, the Hague Convention concerns, while legally unfounded, presented a public relations problem. The U.S. military had prosecuted German soldiers for using prohibited ammunition. Having used questionable ammunition, even if technically legal, was awkward. Second, the ammunition's limitations made it impractical for peacetime production. The cost per round was 340% higher than standard ammunition. The shelf life was 18 months versus 30 years for standard rounds. The storage requirements were demanding. For a peacetime military focused on cost efficiency, M2HE made no sense. Third, the atomic weapons rendered conventional infantry ammunition improvements relatively insignificant. The military's focus shifted to nuclear weapons, guided missiles, and jet aircraft. Small arms development received reduced priority and funding. The classification remained until 1980. The National Archives, processing World War II documents for declassification, discovered Project Thunder files. A review board determined the technical information was no longer sensitive. The Soviet Union had developed similar ammunition decades earlier. On March 12, 1980, Project Thunder was declassified.